Hi, it's Laura. I'm here to share some hope during this time of physical distancing due to COVID-19. If you do find some hope, then I encourage you to share, like, or comment on the video below in YouTube. You know, it was my first day of university and I was so excited. I was looking forward to new adventures. I was in a new country. I was going to make new friends. And of course, I was going to learn a lot. And on that first morning, a professor handed out a blank piece of paper and she asked us to draw bread. And I thought, really? I flew all this way and paid how much so that I can draw bread? That's not really what I was looking for in my university education. And I was sitting near some British students and we joked and showed our pictures and laughed at our inability to draw. Or more likely, they were laughing at my inability to draw. But soon enough, the professor pointed to a young man and asked him to share his picture. And he stood up and he showed a round piece of flatbread. And then she asked the French student to stand up and she showed her long, slender baguette. And I soon realized that in our classroom there were so many different kinds of bread. Loaves, round, square, flat, puffy, that I did not expect. In my ignorance, I thought everyone was going to draw the same loaf of bread that I did. And she said, you know, we begin our conversations based on the assumption that everyone has the same starting point. But it is not until you stop and get to know someone's worldview that you can have full and complete understanding between each other. Now, if you know me, you will know that one of the themes that I speak about often is your picture of God. What is your picture of God and how do you draw him? How do you see him? I've heard it said that our first concept of God is based on our impression of our Father. We place the same characteristics on God that we think of our dads. Maybe you think that he is absent. Maybe you think that he's kind or funny or mean or angry or even abusive, unfortunately. Some people would draw God with a round, jolly face, more resembling Santa, as someone who is there to give us what we want when we ask. Some people would draw a long, drawn-out face of sadness, disappointment, maybe even of uncaring. And some people would even draw a big puffed up picture of God to say that he is a dictator and demands his own way on his people. There are so many images that we all have personally of God and who he is. And I've heard it say that the God of the Old Testament is very different than the God of the New Testament, and I would challenge that. But what really doesn't matter is what you think of who God is or who I think God is. What truly matters is who God says that he is. And the Bible, in recognition that we would never be able to understand or grasp fully who God is, paints pictures of him using metaphors and imagery. We have David, who for most of his life fled, describes God as his refuge. We see Abraham in the middle of a war where he was totally outnumbered, describing God as his shield. We have so many images of God as warrior, healer, peacemaker, king, even fire. But I want to share today a story in Luke 15 where Jesus uses a parable to describe heaven and to describe God. And the image that he chooses is to describe God as a father. And the story starts to say that a man had 2 sons. And the younger son said to his father, you know, I want to make it on my own. I want to make my own name. I don't want to live off of your name. So I want you to give me my inheritance now. The father complied. And a few days later, the son packed up his belongings and left for good. And while he was away, he lived it up. He enjoyed himself. He was hitting the clubs. He was doing everything that he probably should not have been doing, and that went against what his father had taught him. He lived an undisciplined and reckless life. And after a while, as money does, it runs out. And then a famine hit, and he had no way to sustain himself. So he ended up taking a job feeding pigs. And as he was feeding the pigs, his stomach was grumbling and his heart was hurting. And I just imagine him leaning against a fence with one foot up and perhaps a piece of grass coming out of his mouth, chewing on it as he's thinking, these pigs are pretty fat and they are eating rather well. And here I am starving. And there are servants in my father's house who are eating much better than I am. And he thought, I'm going to swallow my pride and I'm going to go home. I'm going to go to my father and I'm going to beg him. I'm going to say, I know that I'm not worthy to be called your son, but I'm willing to be a servant in this house as long as I can be part of this household. And he didn't just think it, he took action. And he walked home. And I imagine every step of the way he was rehearsing his speech and how his father was going to react and what he was going to say and what the neighbors would say and how he would get home and get any food or anything along the way. But as he got home, the Bible says he was still a long way off. And the father saw him and ran to him and embraced him and kissed him over and over. And the son started to give his well-rehearsed speech to say, I know that I have sinned, and I have sinned against you and against God, and I am no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father was not listening. He called to another servant and said, bring a robe, bring sandals, and bring a ring for my son, because I thought he was lost, but he is found. And this story tells us exactly who God is. It gives us a picture of God that perhaps we may not have drawn on our own. So in this picture, what do we see about the Father? We see that the Father, in this case God, requires obedience in his house. The Son left, which means he couldn't do everything that he wanted to do. He had responsibilities. And we see later in the story that the older brother was working in the field all day. So there was some element of work and responsibility that was required. And it's interesting because we would not question an earthly father who required his children to have chores and to help in the running of his house. And yet I have heard it said, I don't mind God, I don't mind this concept of God, but I don't want him telling me what I should do. Well, that really speaks to a lack of understanding or seeing God as creator. God who created us has the right and the privilege to ask anything of those that he has created. We see in this story that God gives choice. He let the son leave. He did not say, you owe me. You're not leaving this house. And he even gave him resources. He said, take the money, use it. He gave him some form of protection, even as he chose to leave his father's house. We see that God never gives up. The story says that the father saw his son while he was a long way off. Now, the only way you can see someone a long way off is if you are looking for them and you're searching for them. And that's what we see with God. He never gives up on us. He sees us and seeks us out day after day after day. We see that God gives complete forgiveness. The son was ready to take a subordinate role. The son was ready to not even return home initially. But God and the Father in this story says, you are forgiven completely and you are now reinstated as my son. He didn't ask him any questions. He didn't ask him how much money he had left. He didn't even give him a sarcastic, oh, you decided to come now? You came home now that your belly's empty and you expect me to feed you? He didn't do any of that. He just completely forgave him. And lastly, we see in this story that God restores us. He put on sandals on his feet, a robe, and he gave him a ring. Now, in those days, when someone wanted to send a letter or sign a legal document, they would put hot wax on it, and the person would put their signet ring in it, and that would be an impression in the wax. And so what he was doing by saying, "Here is a ring," he said to his son, "I restore you to your rightful place, and I give you the right to speak on my behalf." That's amazing. He didn't say, let's have a little trial period here. I need to make sure that you're not going to just eat, steal from my pantry, take off. He said, "I restore you as my son, and I do it immediately." As the story continues, we see that the older brother was working all day out in the field, and when he came in, he heard a party, and he said, "What's going on in the house?" And a servant said to him, "Your brother has returned home, and your father is throwing a party." And I imagine he might have even felt slighted that he didn't hear it from his father, but he heard it from a mere servant. But we see again, the father steps out to his son. The father came out again, because God is always seeking, and God is the one who always takes the initiative to get to know us, to restore us to right relationship. Everything is always initiated by God. Now, I don't know how you have lived. I don't know if you have been one who's lived in the house, if you have developed a good relationship with God or a relationship with God, and you have tried your best to obey his rules as you understand them and as best as you could. Or if you are the person who has lived recklessly and immorally, even making intentional decisions of, "I know this is wrong, but I'm going to do it anyway." How do you draw God? What is your image that comes to mind when you think of God? I don't know if your picture of God is one where you show him as kind, compassionate, or if you show him as angry, bitter, disappointed at you. But I can tell you that the Father desires you, and that the Father longs for you to come home. I want you to know that whether your disobedience was intentional or whether it was simply an error, that the Father is on the heavenly porch, and he is seeking you out, and he is looking for you every single day. And even if you do know him and you do accept that you are a child of God, he still is waiting for you, because he wants to spend time with you. Even though the older son lived in the house, he clearly did not know and understand his father. Because for him to say, "I have slaved for you these many years, yet you didn't throw me a party." He wasn't doing these things because he loved God, or the Father. He was doing them because he felt there was an obligation. He thought he was earning his right to his inheritance. But you can't earn your way into a relationship with God. Just like any other relationship, we get to know God by spending time with him. The other day, someone said, I spend practically every hour on my screen now. You wake up, you glance at your phone, you get up. If you're working, you go to your computer and look on there. Then you take your laptop, you go downstairs when you're finished and you watch TV, and then you check your phone again before you go to sleep, and your mind is constantly stimulated. When do you spend time just getting to know God? I want to encourage you to spend time reading the Bible, just getting to know him, or even just turning off the phone, turning off the laptop and going for a walk and just looking at nature and talking to God as you would any other friend. I hope that as a result of this, you have a new color that you can put in your palette to draw your picture of God. And I hope that you will continue to grow in your understanding of who he is and who he says that he is. Be safe, and thank you.